in children's services the next phase. So thank you.
Shall I start then? Yeah, shall it? Great. Okay, so we've brought 3 reports from Children's Services to select this morning. They're all very much interrelated, and I thought it would be helpful to give you a presentation just to try and summarise those reports and to kind of bring to the fore the way that they interrelate with each other. And just to get us started, these 3 reports are part of the ongoing programme for delivering excellence in children's services, which was a 3-year programme approach that we put into place beginning in 2016. So we're kind of at the midway point of that programme now, and this is very much about the next step along that particular pathway. Very brief recap. The Delivering Excellence programme has 4 main work streams. It's around delivery model, operational processes, pathways and so forth. The workforce, getting that skilled, competent, stable workforce in place to be able to deliver against that operational model. Commissioning, which is around getting right services in the right place. And we added the 4th work stream partway into the programme, which we described as service critical. And it was to make sure that where things did need that extra bit of focus and attention within the service, that we were able to kind of mobilise some resources around those particular areas. And the 3 reports that are before you today link in some ways across all of those work streams, but there are 3 particular reports. One is workforce, one is around our family support review, more aligned to work stream 3, and the fostering project, again, more aligned to work stream 3. Within our programme approach at the moment, our current objectives include focusing on our family support services, both within children's services itself, as what we describe as our statutory services, and also on those children's services which play such an important part in working with vulnerable families, around those families that haven't yet come into the front door of children's services. We're also, within our work programme, putting particular attention on our fostering project. We're ongoing trying to increase our workforce to meet demands and manage the risks across the service. We're trying to really develop our data-driven approaches and bringing that forensic kind of scrutiny to the service to make sure that everything is lined up correctly. And we're trying to make sure that some of the real risks to the service are highlighted. At the moment, that's particularly from the current judiciary. So that's just a bit of a summary of our current objectives and where our current reports sit within them. So just thinking through what we have to do today. And I've taken this to the whole workforce, which is where this slide originated from. And part of our thinking, obviously, is just making sure that that we're trying to make these changes and developments within the service very much with the financial position of the local authority in mind and the budget envelope that is given to children's services. You know, we're very aware of that this isn't just about gathering more in. It's really trying to align what we're doing with the medium-term financial planning of the overall authority and making sure that some of our work streams really do play that out. Our fostering project, of course, does that through a concentration on trying to reduce our dependence on independent fostering agencies, the IFAs there. We're also trying to pursue our continuing healthcare arrangements with health so that we maximise our resource coming into the authority from a financial point of view. and also looking at some of our very high cost placements, that pathways to independence approach, trying to make sure that any resource that can be released from high cost placements are addressed. Because we know as a service we've got to be sustainable and we've got to move with the times, and we have to be aware of our financial position and the consequences that our plans have on the overall authority's medium-term financial plans. So that's the kind of preamble bit. Just thinking about the family support report first. As I've said, family support for children's services is in two parts. There's the family support that happens for families before they may need services of the statutory children's services, and then there's family support that sits within our children's services itself. And when we were very first setting out on the programme approach for children's services, we did some baselining work to try and understand the current position of family support within Monmouthshire, and that identified for us that we had a real gap in family support around the pre-statutory work. So quite a good range of services in that left-hand side of the windscreen, a gap in family support services towards the edge of statutory, and again quite a low level of actual family intervention services that we could draw upon within statutory children's services itself. So the gaps that were identified were on the amber and red squares within that threshold model. So we're currently trying to address both those areas. Now, what we've set out in the report that to try and address those gaps, we're seeking to realign the existing TAF team, which at the moment in its current delivery model coordinates other services to then go and deliver interventions to families. And what we would like to do now is to just change the emphasis of the resource that sits within that team so that they are actually the support workers with the families themselves. So they no longer coordinate and broker in, but they actually become the people working directly with those families, delivering some set out programmes of intervention based on what we know works with families in that early stage of vulnerability. And to support the TAF team workers within that, we want to locate them within the face-to-face service and relocate face-to-face, which is a therapeutic service with skills in direct working with children and families. We are seeking to relocate face-to-face to sit within the overall children's services service area. So that then provides us with that ability to really increase our coherent approach, that pathway of family support for families wherever they touch that windscreen model, whether it's very early or towards that more needy side of the windscreen. As part of that, we need to reconfigure the TAF coordinator post so that we can just reevaluate the job role within that, given that it's then sitting within face-to-face, so that again releases a little bit of resource which we can use then to support the system from an administrative point of view. And as part of that work, creating a multi-agency early support and prevention referral pathway to really bring all those early help services together, including TAF, on a weekly basis to really just talk about those families, think about those families who are needing help and deciding at what level of help they need. Do they just need those universal services on that front end of the windscreen, or do they need that more intensive support that we're hoping our TAF workers can then deliver? We clearly need to develop and think further about our step up and step down protocols so that wherever those families sit, there is a clear pathway, particularly between children's statutory and the pre-early help, early intervention services that sit towards the left of the windscreen. So just thinking about the recommendations for TAF itself, they're thinking about a new name for themselves, Build a Stronger Families. It's just capturing it again specifically for TAF, realigning the work that they do so that they're providing interventions rather than coordinating services, so that they're then enabled to deliver programmes of interventions to vulnerable families. It's resource neutral, consumes its own smoke. We're aiming to increase our contact with families from 60 a year to 150 a year, doing much more targeted interventions. Reduction in delay, because it's not dependent on a kind of administrative process, but more those weekly case discussion allocation meetings. We're hoping to eliminate or further eliminate duplication, so that in those allocation meetings, we're really understanding across that whole service spectrum who is best to do what at this point in time for this particular family, and try and bring that one service approach where one service is needed, rather than scatterguns, which can tend to happen. And, really addressing the gap that we identified, building resources at that point for a family's journey that sits just below statutory intervention, and hopefully by doing that, helping families not needing to pass through that front door. As a kind of the sister piece of work alongside of that, which is slightly less developed within the report at the moment and may well need to go for further process of scrutiny and cabinet decision making at a later stage. But what our vision is that we're very much hoping that we've got our family support services at that kind of left side of the windscreen. What we're planning to do is to kind of really link that to our family support services that sit within statutory children's services. And to do that, we're going to really refocus on our contact team, have a good understanding of what they do, use the skills that are in there currently to start developing a real sense of what family support could look like within our statutory service. We've got some money coming into us from Welsh Government for grants around developing educare services, and some money coming back to us as a service from what was a regional service, which was the Intensive Family Support Team, and really using those two finance streams to really develop our own in-house service for family support, which would concentrate on providing those direct interventions for educare. So children who are through our front door, maybe on the Child Protection Register, maybe new into LAC, looked after status, where we're trying to do what we can to rehabilitate those children back home if it's safe. As the other part of that is we're still, because of our numbers of looked after children at the moment, we're still fairly reliant on spot purchasing some of our supervised contact. So we're going to see if there is a good business case in there to increase that provision to actually as a money saving exercise, and to make sure that we've got the right number of people to provide the services that we are required to provide. And we're going to move, currently the contact team sits within the family support placement and support team. We're going to move that so it becomes part of this early help family support network, so it will come under the early help and assessment line management to really try and make sure that we get that good alignment both across pre-statutory and post-statutory family support. So those are the two strands of our family support. Workforce, I thought I'd show a picture of children's services in the 1970s. Or now. So just to think where we've come from with our workforce part of the programme. The last time we came to CYP Select and Cabinet, we were talking about a whole-scale restructure within children's services, and we created a middle bubble, as we called it, the Family Support and Protection Team, that really worked and concentrated on our child protection and our court work, as that is where our pressure was and still is. So this is the next step along that particular pathway, really trying to make sure that we've got the resources now aligned correctly within our own service across the delivery model that we have. But since we came to you and we did that restructure successfully, our demand has continued to increase. This isn't to dwell on it, it's just, I think we're all fairly well aware that both our numbers of LAC, looked after children, and our numbers of children on the Child Protection Register have continued to see a year-on-year increase. There's been no abatement to that demand, which for us as a service, we don't have a choice of whether we take these cases. We're under statutory framework to work with these children, so we just end up having more and more children open. This is just to say, once you've got children within that kind of particular stage, the cases understandably become not just more numerous, but more complex. You're dealing with children with quite onerous statutory requirements attached to them. You're taking children through court processes. Understandably, that leads to quite complex children's social work. So in response to that, we've been trying to really understand our own service, to understand the workflow through the service, to understand where the pressures are within the service, to look for any bits where we can potentially release one bit of resource to address pressures in another area. And we've been developing and using live team dashboards to really understand case activity and caseloads. And alongside of that, been trying to kind of think, well, what's a safe caseload for a social worker sitting in this particular bit of the business? What does national indicators tell us? What do previous reviews and so forth tell us is an acceptable caseload within that team, so that we can start to kind of map through where we feel that we're resource short. That's just by way of example, the Family Support and Protection team. And these are early conversations. There's no magic number around caseloads. It only provides you a starting point. But we have to start quantifying in some way. So after thinking about where we are with our workforce up to this point, thinking about our demand data, really looking at how we're understanding work sitting within the system, and how that kind of resource demand equation adds up. What were the initial kind of conclusions to that? Well, what we did conclude is that our early help and assessment team, so that front door bubble in terms of workforce, we feel is almost there. We have one over-establishment post in early help and assessment team, and with that taken into account, we feel that we're in the right place so far. But that what the data does tell us is that within that middle bubble, the Family Support and Child Protection team, it's still our highest demand and our highest risk area. We have 4 agency social workers sitting within that team, and if we just go back to this slide, the pink bar shows us where our caseloads would be if we were to eliminate those agency workers out of that team. So at the moment, with those agency workers in place, we're holding our head above the water. If we were to eliminate those agency out of our service, would be way above what would be an acceptable caseload level for that part of the business. We've also identified that there's potential releasable resource within the placement and support team, and that's come to light as part of our fostering project. And within our long-term support team and our children with disabilities team, we're still in the middle of that ongoing forensic approach. We haven't quite yet fully understood whether they're resourced correctly, over-resourced, under-resourced, but at the moment we've got a kind of standpoint position with them. We haven't quite gone into those teams with the same forensic approach as we have with the others yet. The other strand to this is obviously at the moment we're managing to meet our workforce pressures through the use of agency, and that takes us on to a bit of another kind of discussion really is, do we want to be running as a service with agency workers? with our overall aspiration when we set out on the programme was to achieve that stable and permanent workforce, was to reduce agency workers out of our service. And I think that's, for all sorts of reasons, I still feel that that is an aspiration we should continue to aspire to. We know that agency workers create instability within the service. They can bring expertise, but overall, I think that the argument would run that when agency workers are used within the service, they create instability. When they leave, learning leaves with them. Knowledge and history of families and children leaves with them. So that we know already through our own reviews that, you know, continuity of decision making when there's multiple workers is adversely affected. So we still want to stick to that same aspiration. So when we were at the beginning of 16-17, we had 18 agency workers within children's services, and there are now 7, which is a positive achievement for us. There are agency exit plans in place for each of those assignments, but our last 5 are over establishment. So in terms of exit planning them out, unless the demand suddenly decreases, we're a bit stuck. So that's why within our select and hopefully cabinet reports moving forward, we're really seeking to eliminate those agency posts and replace them with permanent workers. So just our workforce conclusions, we've already identified that there is some releasable resource within the placement and support team. So what we're proposing to do is to move one of those full-time social workers from our placement and support team into where the pressures are, which is either the one post in early help and assessment or the post in the family support and protection team. We're then proposing that the 3 agency assignments remaining within the family support and protection team are made into permanent posts, and to release another post resource from within the placement support team, which I'll come on to later, to commission our assessments in a different way. I haven't picked that up on this slide, but that last bullet point there as well is establish one of the agency posts that we've got within the family support and protection team, to assign that into a senior practitioner post. Because we've got so much additional resource coming into the family support team, it just needs to map through in terms of how many people each person managed. So of the 4 additional posts within family support and protection, there'd be 3 social work posts and 1 senior prac posts. And 1 post of the 5 additional we'll create from the family and support team. Okay, so just briefly now on the fostering project, which is the final report. A lot of this is covered already within the workforce because it's about how we're using our resources from that team, but just some specifics that relate to the fostering project. This is just reminding us all that the actual fostering project, not that it was known as that then, started in 2014, so slightly ahead of our overall programme, when we were really clear as an authority that our tipping number around sustainability for fostering was extremely vulnerable. So we set out a 5-year plan to bring some additional resource and investment into the fostering services and set ourselves up around 3 work streams. Some of those targets, you probably can't see these clearly, but they may well be in the report. In fact, they might not be. Basically, we're not quite on track to meet targets. So, for example, when we set out to recruit new foster carers, we're not off track in terms of recruiting new foster carers, but we didn't then account for the number of foster carers who would leave the service for all sorts of different reasons, but it's left us in a net position of not being on track totally to meet our targets. And not only that, we know again that demand has increases, so we're still not where we need to be in terms of our in-house fostering provision. those were just some of when we looked back at our business case and really reviewed it to decide, on whether and how we needed to move forward. We weren't quite understanding, some of the kind of basic principles that those business cases were built upon. We've beginning to correct and improve that now. We've set out a lot more work streams and are starting to kind of see dividends around that fostering project journey. We're doing it very much now, as opposed to 2014, within the context of the National Fostering Framework, which is the Welsh Government's directive to set out a much more regional approach to fostering services across Wales. And within Gwent, we're quite well along that particular road. Not quite sure where we'll end up, whether it'll be kind of minimal approach to regional fostering or an all-in approach, but we've got to bear that in mind when we are planning locally. So through our work within the fostering project, what we've again concluded is that 2 posts are potentially releasable within that work. One, we want to reconfigure and move into the early help and assessment team or family support, which I've already covered. The second post, we want to then realign the resources for that post. Because what we find in fostering is that the work comes in peaks and troughs, particularly around the court work. The work can be quite quiet for a while and then a load of assessments come at once, and that's often as a result of the court work. So if we release that post and moved it into more of a budget for commissioning independence, it would help us manage those peaks and troughs and only be paying for stuff when we needed stuff doing. We'll continue to review all of the roles and responsibilities within that placement and support team. There's a few kind of add-on roles which are essential to us, but we need to make sure that they really do align with our service team and aims. And we know still within the fostering project that there's work to do about making the resource that we have more efficient. So ongoing work to do regarding our systems and processes. And I think that's the last one. So thanks for bearing with me on that. And hopefully that cross-references nicely to the reports, I hope.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rogers, both for the presentation and the way in which it refers to the formal reports that we've had in our agenda packs. Ms. Marchant, is there anything you want to say at this point?
No, I think James covered it.
Okay, thank you. I certainly have got various questions, but I'm sorry I missed the pre-meeting. I'm sure that members of the committee will have preempted them. So, Councillor Powell.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you for that presentation. It was very enlightening. Only a couple of questions. There's quite a lot of changes where you're changing from temporary to full-time. Overall, is this going to make a big difference to the number of people that are employed within this group? Or is it more changing their type of job rather than bringing more in? And the other one is, which you have answered a bit because you said you've got money coming, some money from the Welsh Government and some coming back from somewhere. I just wondered, how much it's all going to cost when it's finished, whether you're going to struggle or whether this money is going to help. Thank you.
It's so the first part of the question, how many more additional people will be employed? It'll be for the early help section of it, no additional people will be employed. For the children's services section of it, there will be 4 additional people employed. And that will approximately £200,000. But within our medium-term financial plan that we submitted to the council, we are proposing to meet those costs via savings from our budget plan next year. Those are particularly around the increased use of Monmouthshire carers rather than IFAs. We're looking at the moment, 2 children that are in very expensive residential placements that we're hoping by the end of 18-19 that we'll be able to create a more an in Monmouthshire provision for them. And again, there's money saving to be had within that. And we're, as I mentioned, we're really trying to pursue with health that we're correctly resourced from health around some of our very high cost children, where we believe strongly that they should be funded by health, or at least partially funded by health. So although 200,000, it is a lot of money, we're asking for a lot of money. When you think about a placement costing £4,000 or £5,000 a week, if we can, through the work that we're doing, make savings, we are, you know, with the best will, trying to fund our own requests. Do you want to add?
Just to say that there will be a need for you as a select committee to join up these reports with the scrutiny that you'll do around the budget, which I think is coming through to December select committees, because the financial plan which we're putting forward as part of that process for children's services is over a 4-year period. The reason for bringing these reports forward in advance is that at the moment we're spending money, and as Jane described around the agency workforce, it's not the best way to spend money, because the level of activity within the service means that you know, we simply need to have that workforce in place. But in terms of that financial analysis within the report, joining it up with what you'll see when the budget reports come through for scrutiny, I think is going to be really important. You know, very generally, children's services in Monmouthshire, which is what we're concerned around, but across Wales and indeed the UK, continue to be under extreme pressure around particularly those relatively small numbers in the scheme of things, but very high cost individual placements. And as you start to see monitoring coming through for month 7 as well in year, we're experiencing particular pressures and having to take particular recovery actions, which Jane has already alluded to as a consequence of that. The answers to all of these things aren't easy, but the improvement programme which Jane has so eloquently described around early intervention and prevention, the right family support office, the right level of competent workforce, who are, you know, employed in the most cost-effective way, all join up to be the most cost-effective way of managing a very volatile set of circumstances in terms of our most vulnerable children.
Councillor Thomas?
It just seems to me that, you know, and thanks for the presentation, it's very clear, but all of those sort of drifts through that presentation, to me, seem to make sense in terms of having more keeping children in-house, which is a good point. Permanent staff, in my opinion, is a strong point. And my experience is more in teaching, whatever, but if you're having teaching children taught by, say, supply staff all the time, it doesn't provide continuity, and that sort of in-house knowledge of, in your case, the looked after children and for the early intervention. And I just think overall having permanent staff is a better resource than, I wouldn't use the word wasting money, but I think it's very expensive. You look at NHS or schools, buying in temporary staff is quite an expensive way of doing it, and at the end of the day you want to develop a strong in-house workforce that can cope with the demand, and obviously demand is rising as was shown on the graphs, really. So I feel very inclined to what's been put forward.
Thank you very much. Councillor Jones.
Thank you. The money aspect of it has cropped up a couple of times, and could you give us some indication to help understanding of how much more expensive a supply, in inverted commas, social worker is compared to a full-time one? Thank you.
Approximately, it's £12,000 to £13,000 per annum is the saving. So it's substantial, yeah.
Thank you very much. Any other questions from... Yes, Mr. Fowler.
Hi. It's encouraging to know that you've kind of gone through this, your whole service, and it's coming together and moving team in around the family more into the service sounds great because it becomes a unified service rather than lots of little projects. It's encouraging to see that you've gone through it in that level of detail, and reading some of the papers where the do-nothing approach encourages low productivity. And so it's good that you're reassigning and getting everything right. But again, it's this permanent workforce, and I guess we're not going to see the numbers of looked after children and child protection cases go down. So we almost need that bold decision now to make all our agency staff permanent, get that proper workforce, take the double win of stability of workforce and the resource we need, because it's not going to go away, and these figures, we can't avoid them. So I think bold moves need to be taken. So it looks like a step in the right direction. Well done.
Thank you very much indeed. Councillor Woodhouse.
Thank you, Chair. As a new councillor, can you just explain to me what families, the funding is that comes from Families First, and what percentage that is, towards the cost of running the department? And also with regard to looking to other areas, other authorities, what sort of experiences, best practice you've been able to sort of look at and consider along the way to help you put this together?
Families First funding doesn't fund any of statutory children's services. So the Families First funding will only fund services that are on that left bit of the windscreen. So it doesn't fund statutory children's services at all. In terms of the TAF team, it currently funds the entirety of the TAF team. So because they're not that statutory bit, they're still in that early help prevention. Families First funds our TAF team currently. But did you want to add anything?
Yeah. It's a specific grant from Welsh Government, and as all specific grants, it's got very clear terms and conditions in terms of the activity, as Jane has said, that will be funded and won't. It funds a range of different activities from those which are at, I suppose, the edge of statutory intervention, such as the team around the family, and then, very much earlier preventative services as well, like our Acorn Centre, for example. So that, it does provide a range of early intervention and preventative services, which are really, really important to preventing children and families escalating up into statutory provision.
In terms of the second part of your question, yes, we've looked extensively across other local authorities to really understand what best models of practice are. We've looked particularly, there was a systemic review undertaken by IPC, which was looking specifically at what are the most effective models of family support, and we've very much used that to kind of build our own vision around family support. And what they tell us really is coherence, really clear pathways, lots of opportunities for those early help services to understand what each other does and to kind of collectively agree, well, this service will be best for this family at this time. They also tell us that, in a way, what you need is those families who are the most vulnerable before they come to us. They need a worker who they link with and form a relationship with, and who can provide the motivation and agency for those families to make the changes that are required. And at that pre-statutory stage is when families are actually at their most potentially open to change, because problems are not yet entrenched. They've not had the kind of cynicism of some families who've been around that system. So there's lots of positive potential to enable them to change if the relationship with a key worker is absolutely at the heart of that. So some families who are really the most vulnerable, having that broker-in of agency kind of model isn't effective, because they're lacking something that's actually the linchpin, the holding it together, the real relationship building with an individual worker. And again, we've used that very much to kind of really understand our model of what we mean by family support going forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Councillor Woodhouse, you want to come back?
No, just going to say very helpful, thank you.
Thank you. I have one query and a slight question that might well be part of that, I think, really. The second report, the multi-agency early support, I think we all value effective multi-agency working. At the same time, many of us that have had to try to put it in place over the years find that it is far from easy to deliver multi-agency working. Have you given any thought yet as to issues around HR at a very simple level, where different agencies are trying to provide a unified service? Who will manage it? Who will have responsibilities for management within it? And issues like that. And then from that, and I apologise, I'm going to hide behind our live stream viewers will need to know the jargon, but actually the reality is I'd like to know what the jargon means. What is a step up, step down protocol, please?
Well, if I take the last bit first, so step up, step down is really that it is the shorthand that we use, particularly around where a family sits on a threshold between needing that early help prevention approach and needing a statutory formal response from Children's Services. And quite often what you find in operational practice, it can be a bit like, well, who's owning this particular family? Who's owning this concern? Is it your concern? Is it our concern? And having good protocols based on really understanding a family's needs, understanding what a risk approach to working with that family would be, are helpful in facilitating that dialogue where a family is on that cusp of needing to pass from kind of one bit of a business to another bit of the business. It works in a kind of, it crystallises around the threshold between non-statutory and statutory intervention, but in fact can be at actually, it happens at all levels of when a service is maybe, a family is maybe passing between services. So that's what we mean. The second bit of the question, yeah, absolutely. Good multi-agency working underpins what will be an effective early help and support system. We haven't got all the answers yet, but we've got some mechanisms in place that we're hoping to really help us along that particular road. We've got our Children and Family Strategic Partnership within its third meeting, where many of our ideas will be helped and indeed shaped by the relationships within the Children and Family Strategic Partnership. So that really allows us, as more of a strategic level, to be thinking through the operational implications of what we're trying to achieve and making sure that those messages go right out to the services, Families First funded services, and others within the independent and voluntary sector, really do over time kind of come into the fold, align with us. The multi-agency weekly allocation stroke referral panel will be critical within that. We've already, from an operational point of view, we've already had many discussions with the primary mental health care, who are also trying to do that kind of early help approach around joining up those two approaches. So although we're not there yet at all, we've got many conversations started with our multi-agency partners to assist, and also some formal mechanisms which will similarly assist with the multi-agency aspect of this particular programme.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. Are there any further questions before we wrap up this agenda item? Yes, Mr. Fowler.
Oh, hi. Just going back to the team around the family rejig, if you like. Just thinking through that a little bit. Obviously, before they were a team that coordinated, and now your proposal's to make them face-to-face. Are they still the right staff in that new role? Because obviously that's a very different skill set, moving from coordinating to working with the children. Are they the right people, essentially? And is it a matter of training, or is it beyond that?
I mean, obviously not to get into too much detail around individuals, but yes, we're confident in that service, because in actual fact, just because of the nature of the families that they were working with, they were feeling themselves that they weren't quite giving those families what they needed, and were just taking it upon themselves really to kind of form those relationships with families. They're motivated, they're actually skilled, they're well trained, and we're really confident of that service going forward indeed.
Well, I think that wraps up our discussion on this particular agenda item. I'd like to thank the two officers for coming along. It's an interesting start to their week to have to face elected members. So thank you both very much indeed. In summary, I think from the chair, it's getting on for 2 years now since the reconfiguration of these services was begun, and it's good to see the progress and the very clear rationale that is being presented to us. There is still work in progress, but thank you very much for coming, and I hope you have got the impression that I have from the chair that the committee has been supportive of the work you've done so far. So thank you both very much indeed for that presentation and for the reports that you brought to us this morning. If we could move on then to the next agenda item, which is on safeguarding, and Ms. Martin, I believe you're doing this as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. The report that you have this morning for consideration is an evaluation report which sets out really an analysis of our performance in terms of our safeguarding responsibilities as a county council. It's very much a draft report, and we, Jane and myself and Diane and Kath, who aren't here this morning, would welcome lots of scrutiny of this and lots of comments around the measures, and you'll see particularly in the report that we haven't given ourselves an evaluative score yet around our performance, and that's because we want the input of this committee, more input from our whole authority safeguarding coordinating group, so that we feel that when we're recommending to Cabinet around that, that's in light of lots and lots of different views around the sort of strength of the evidence around our performance. The report itself relates back to the corporate safeguarding policy, which was approved by Council back in July still this year, and the policy which we took forward was the first time that as a council we had a policy which incorporated both safeguarding of adults at risk and child protection and children, and that's really important for us because it's in line with the legislation which is now in place in Wales through the Social Services and Wellbeing Act. The report attempts to set out some key measures in terms of our performance against the standards within that policy in the critical areas of good governance, a safe workforce, a preventative approach, robust protection arrangements and safe services. And I guess one of the sort of underlying aspects of the report is, are we properly articulating and identifying what good looks like in those different areas? And have we got supporting evidence, data and information which tells us how well we're doing? Have we got clear analysis which underpins how we score ourselves, and are we making this report come alive for members and anybody else who may be interested in understanding our performance? And that's part of the reason we've included for the first time really some case studies which hopefully help to explain what good looks like in the different areas. In terms of safeguarding, I suppose as Chief Officer, my overall analysis, the one thing which I'm always very keen to stress is that safeguarding is always work in progress. We never get there. If ever we start to be a little complacent around safeguarding, then we're in the wrong place. We need to see it always as a journey of continuous improvement. And that's why within the report, we're always very keen to emphasise what's yet to be done as well as where we are. There's always an aspect in safeguarding, isn't there, of getting the absolute basics right, the basics around governance, the basics around child protection, around protection of adults at risk. the basic, as I would see it, around safe recruitment of our whole workforce, and that's both our on-payroll and our off-payroll workforce as a council that we engage through volunteering, and the basics around commissioning and safe services, recognising that as a council, the services we provide are actually a relatively small proportion of the range of services which are out there from both an adult and a children's point of view. In terms of the approach to evaluation and understanding and governance, I guess, from an officer point of view, we have our whole Authority Safeguarding Coordinating Group, and that brings together officers. Sorry, I got a bit of a frog in my throat still this week. At a senior level from each directorate across the council, and they are required to make sure there's that link back into their directorate management teams around safeguarding as we develop. Each part of the council, each service area is required to complete something called a SAFE, self-evaluation. And those sort of members of children and young people will remember that used to just cover off children's services. It now incorporates adults at risk as well, so that's a really important development. And then we've got strong relationships with audit as well, in terms of our own self-evaluation and that sort of independent analysis of where we are. An important part of our governance framework is the regional safeguarding boards, which our heads of service from adults and children represent us on, and our members of safeguarding and quality assurance unit are strongly engaged in too. And that's another sort of important element in terms of your scrutiny of us, really, is your sort of, I guess, visibility of what's happening in the name of the statutory responsibilities we have, which are undertaken at a regional level. Are those lines of sight as important and as clear as they need to be in our reporting arrangements? The second aspect then of our report around safe workforce. I mentioned safe recruitment. That is an absolute basic, isn't it? But we always need to be vigilant around it. There will still from time to time be cases which slip through when not everything is in place, and we need to make sure that we've got that culture of learning, putting things right, and making sure that we're actually looking at any systemic issues and learning lessons as we go forward around that, particularly around on payroll, but equally the volunteering workforce. Pause for a second there. Training and competency of our workforces is incredibly important as well across the piece. And one of the things we're really focused on at the moment is making sure that we've got the right training tools for both children and adults at risk available across, from that very basic awareness raising right through to sort of strategic leadership. And then we've got the information systems which enable us to properly advise you, and for us to be advised as well whether we've got any gaps. So, you know, our reporting has tended to be about numbers going through particular training elements. It doesn't then tell you about the numbers not going through, does it? And that's something which is a work in progress and needs to improve over the next while. The third element there is around professional concerns, and we have a piece of work at the moment to bring together the way that we manage professional concerns for people working with adults at risk and children, because there have been some slight differences in the way that that's been managed. Preventative approach, I think this is a really important element of any safeguarding evaluation. Yes, it's critical that we do things right in a protective sense where there are issues, but if we can raise awareness and understand and have the right preventative offers, as we just spent some time talking about through the reports earlier, that stop people getting into those requirements for protection, then we're doing our job very well. And there are a number of different, I guess, sort of proxy type service offers which we refer to within the report around the work of environmental health and trading standards and licensing, the work that we do within schools through the youth service, which are all in that sort of place which hopefully will prevent and raise awareness. And it might mean, as you see with some of the examples around child sexual exploitation, actually that we put in place protective plans for people who are at risk, but hopefully before we're into a place of having to manage from a child protection point of view. Protection itself from both a adult at risk and a children point of view, that when we are in those statutory places, making sure that everybody is aware of their duty to report and that we're managing those processes within our time scales. We do have some obviously very clear performance standards and management arrangements around those particular aspects of our work. And then the whole service offer. This is the first time that you will have seen information to the extent that you have within the safeguarding report around the activity from a commissioning point of view. I'm very conscious at the moment that's commissioning from a social care and health point of view rather than other directorates, but it's all work in progress. So at least you're starting to see some of the activity around quality assurance and around how we monitor commissioned services and accredit them and all the rest of that commissioning cycle within this report as well. So, as I said right at the start, this is very much a draft report. Greatly welcome any comments, whether it's on the format and whether it's easily understandable, areas that you'd like to see more information or views about how effective our safeguarding arrangements are. And I'll stop now before my voice totally gives out on me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Marchant. Before I throw it open for questions from the committee, at a slight tangent, one of the first meetings I attended here after my election in May was some safeguarding training that you organised for members in our role as corporate parents. The first event that you organised was let me be blunt, quite pitifully attended, I thought. Are you now in a position where all members have undertaken that statutory training so that they're aware of their responsibilities?
No, we're not. And when we're looking at gaps in training, there are gaps in training for members as well as gaps in training for officers throughout the authority. What we're looking to do, because we know that that whole corporate induction, there was a lot of training very quickly, wasn't there, over a relatively short period of time, which was difficult for all members to get to all of it. We're going to have something available on the hub, which for that basic safeguarding awareness training will be available to everybody to be delivered in a sort of way which hopefully is easy for everybody to access. And we can also look at putting on another safeguarding training session itself before a council meeting. Is probably the best way to capture as many members as we possibly can.
Thank you very much for that. Councillor Harris, before we do anything else, could I just say that should be a recommendation going forward, that this committee asks that that safeguarding responsibility is pursued. Can I bring in Councillor Jones, our Cabinet Member?
Thank you, Chair. Just to reiterate that it's an area that's of vital importance and one that I'm very concerned about, but not only the actual training, but the recording of such. So we are actually organising corporate parenting training to a mop-up session, and we think probably the best time is prior to a council meeting to get the numbers in, and also, as Claire has said, we will carry out just another safeguarding training as well. So by all means, put it down as a recommendation, please, to keep us on our toes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Jones. Councillor Harris.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, Claire, you mentioned that the training is going to be on the hub. How will we know the results of anyone looking at that? I.e., I can say, I've looked at the hub and I've done the training. You don't know that, do you? Or do you actually know that, if you understand my meaning?
I think one of the issues that I think we've been facing in terms of how we report effectively against training is having those information systems which flow right through, both for members and for officers of the authority. At the moment, we're very dependent on people at a team level, I'm talking officers now, reporting and having their own information systems in place, which then feed up through into corporate reports, whole authority reports, where we're able to see the picture across the piece. And there was a requirement to do that as part of the SAFE process, and we're having to follow that through to make sure there's the granularity of information there at each team level by spreadsheets which are feeding into us on a whole authority level. Having had this bugbear for a little while, from a on payroll and off-payroll volunteering point of view, we've now got systems which we're going to be using which should enable that reporting to be far better. So we'll be using ResourceLink and MyView from an on-payroll point of view, so that all that's work that team managers have had to do to make sure the spreadsheets that they've got at an individual team level are accurate will now feed up into our ability to report for officers in a sort of accurate way, if I put it that way, whether there are gaps or not gaps, and make sure then we've got the training office in place to overcome those gaps. Now, from a member point of view, we're really very reliant, I guess, on democratic services and on group leaders in making sure, in that same way that I'm asking team managers on a employee basis to make sure that there is a record of training, we're reliant for the members on groups and democratic services to make sure that there is that record, because unless I'm mistaken, I don't think there'll be an automatic way of recording by somebody having viewed that training on the hub that they've done so. They need to be reporting that through their group and into democratic services, and we'll be needing to keep the records in that way.
Thank you very much. Any other comments or questions from members of the committee? Mr. Fowler?
Hi. Through this committee and several other bits and pieces I attend via Monmouthshire, it's quite clear that safeguarding is firmly on Monmouthshire's map, and that's right across the authority. And the corporate policy seems to work. It seems quite robust. I just wonder, though, the one-size-fits-all of our safeguarding approach doesn't seem to be working terribly well for us in schools at the moment in terms of volunteers. It's becoming a bit of a barrier when we're talking about having mums, dads, grandparents come in once a week to read with the children, which as a school is something we value having the community in. We're finding now that having to do a DBS, well, that's fine. We've all been used to that for quite a while to come into school. But now having to have the 2 references as well and having to do level 1 safeguarding, these are all things that are putting off our volunteers from coming in, because it's a checklist of things before they're even allowed to come through the front door. And yes, I acknowledge it is working with our children, but whereas the corporate policy for volunteers wider around the county, once you have a volunteer, it's quite difficult to get rid of them in many instances. Whereas in our schools, it's much more a controlled environment where we're inviting volunteers in, and if we don't want them anymore, we stop inviting them in. But it's just a barrier at the moment that we've got too much of a checklist before we're allowed people in. And looking at references, for example, a lot of our volunteers that we can use during the day are mums and stay-at-home mums and dads. So to have 2 references from them, there's no professional references to be had. So at best, it's a friend or neighbour might be saying, oh yes, they're fab, which isn't really worth the paper it's written on, and it just seems as if it's a paper exercise. And I just wonder whether there should be a better strategy applied to schools rather than the one-size-fits-all for the corporate authority.
Thanks very much for the question. I think you're highlighting something which has been a really live issue for us over the last while. One of the pieces of work that will be coming forward, and I think going into next cabinet, is a volunteering policy, which I think is actually very balanced in terms of the requirements for safeguarding of volunteers, which are a key element within that policy. And all that we're doing within a school's context is in accordance with keeping learners safe, which is obviously the guidance, the statutory guidance around safeguarding in schools. Nothing in a sense that's being asked at the moment is any different from what the guidance has always been. I think because there had been particular issues, and a number of members would have been in the council chamber going back right to the start of this year, where we had a Wales Audit Office report which highlighted some deficiencies in the recruitment of volunteers who were working within our schools, mean that we've had a renewed focus in terms of making sure that with the guidance that we've got, the statutory guidance that there is, that there's the same understanding across the board that, and that we're working, I guess, in quite a sophisticated way of understanding the difference between somebody who undertakes a one-off volunteering opportunity, perhaps in a school fete or at a school disco, or somebody who's got that routine contact with children going into schools on a weekly basis, who does have the opportunity to form trusting relationships with children and young people, and needing to make sure that absolutely the recruitment of those individuals, which is incredibly welcome and so important to our schools, is done in a way which keeps children and keeps our learners safe. So there's been lots and lots of discussion with schools and with governing bodies and with heads and safeguarding leads over the last number of months, which has been led by Will McLean, our Chief Officer, and by Heather Heaney, our Safeguarding in Education Lead Officer, to make sure that they're really supported in understanding, and they're obviously very experienced professionals in their own right, being able to understand the differences between when somebody does need to go through that full safe recruitment process and when somebody is undertaking more of a one-off volunteering opportunity. And I think it's really important in safeguarding that we keep the dialogue going all the time around this, and we take every issue which is raised as a learning opportunity, so that people don't get polarised on these issues, but we really work them through and learn from them. And I think the new safeguarding and the volunteering policy which is coming through really tries to take a very balanced approach around all of this, but the most important aspect being that we're keeping our children and young people safe.
Thank you very much. Any further questions from the committee? I wonder if I could just ask, following on from Mr. Fowler's question really, but at the other end of the lifespan, if you like, the report quite rightly talks about the increasing numbers of the elderly and those adults with dementia in our county. And there are very clear safeguarding needs around that potentially very vulnerable group. Is the same rigour with safeguarding being applied to that group?
Oh, absolutely. As I said in the introductory remarks, that with the legislation we now have in Wales, safeguarding adults at risk is on the same legislative basis as safeguarding children, through the duty of people to report, right through to the way that we manage protection processes if they are indicated. All those sorts of standards within the report, such as prevention, apply equally. That's why we as a council in the last administration were awarded around our work towards becoming a dementia-friendly council, and lots of our businesses and other partners are also going down that road, which is really encouraging that people recognise those needs and are able to protect. That work around trading standards particularly is very critical in understanding people who are at risk of scams and such, that they identify those issues before they become into that protection realm. One of the things which is happening as we speak is that we're bringing together from a safeguarding unit and quality assurance unit point of view, children's and adult safeguarding. That doesn't mean there's going to be exactly the same route in for concerns when they're raised, but it does mean in terms of the things that we can do together from a safeguarding children and a safeguarding adults point of view, that we will. So I referred, for example, to the way that we manage professional strategies, that there should be one standard in terms of the way that we do that, and it makes sense to do that together. The way that we service those regional boards, that we should do that together, and a lot of the learning is coming together around that. So absolutely, and I think this is why I think this morning we invited members of Adult Select along as well to scrutinise this report, because it now equally applies to adults at risk as children.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. In summary then, this is a work in progress, and I think as another recommendation, we would like to see the finished work with your self-evaluation judgment when you're in a position to do that. But thank you very much for bringing us along the information as to where we are now, and certainly when you go back a few years to where the county was in terms of safeguarding then. Clearly, a great deal of work has already been accomplished, for which our thanks, and if you could pass that on to those professionals directly involved in that work as well. If we could move on then to the final agenda item, which is agenda item 5, which is simply to confirm the date of our next meeting as being the 7th of December, pre-meeting at 9:30, and then the meeting itself beginning at 10 o'clock. Can I thank you all very much for your attendance and thank the officers for their responses and presentations this morning. Thank you, everybody.